what if I'm not right? What if I'm like not even just not right? What if I'm like super wrong? What then? What if I don't know? What if? And by asking some of the what if questions and starting to realize that, God, the more questions I ask, the more implausible that it would ever seem that I actually could know the right answers to all of the things. And man, once you start to get comfortable with that, curiosity gets a whole lot easier.
Welcome to the True Leadership Podcast, where we sit down with executive leaders to explore what leadership really means through the lens of their stories, their wins, their struggles, their vision, and their lessons along the way. I'm Ty Hammond, founder of One Mountain Leadership and creator of the True Leadership Approach, an awareness-based path that helps leaders shift their focus from what to do about their problems to how to grow from them. Whether you're just stepping into leadership or are well-seasoned and at the top of your game, your potential won't be realized following someone else's script, but you can draw insights from their stories and turn it into wisdom by putting it into practice in your own life. Welcome to the True Leadership Podcast, where we explore the essence of leadership beyond tactics and performance by sitting down with executives to hear what matters most to them. I'm your host, Ty Hammond. Today's guest is Dr. Chris Pachel. Chris is a board-certified veterinary behaviorist, speaker, and educator who bridges veterinary medicine, behavior science, and real-world relationships. Is owner of the Animal Behavior Clinic in Portland and VP of Veterinary Behavior at Instinct Dog Training. He helps pets, professionals, and caretakers transform behavior challenges into opportunities for deeper connection. Internationally recognized as a lecturer and contributor to leading veterinary publications, Dr. Pachel is known for his ability to make complex behavioral science accessible, compassionate, and practical. His work is guided by a simple belief: when we truly understand behavior, we don't just improve the lives of animals, we also change how we relate to each other. It's a real pleasure for me to have Chris on the podcast today. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me, Ty. It's truly a pleasure to be here. You and I have known each other for quite a while now at this point, so this is truly a joy to spend some time with you today.
Absolutely. You got to the full transparency note before I did. Having met each other as speakers at a conference, I think it's 10 years ago now. So fantastic. And yes, I've been very much looking forward to this conversation myself. Here's the opening question. Every leader has a beginning. I've really found, of course, that who we are as leaders takes shape long before we are in any executive leadership position, often before we even start to work. I'm curious if you are able to share someone from your early life or maybe an early experience, someone or something that shaped the kind of leader that you are today.
You know, it's an interesting question, especially when you look across multiple decades and kind of thinking, God, where did this all come from? Where did it distill from? And, you know, I think about leadership in terms of the responsibility that one holds for the lives of others, you know, as one way to think about that. And honestly, one of the first leadership positions that I had, I started work as a young employee before it was probably legal to have taxes taken out of my paycheck. But I've been, just as soon as I was legal, I worked at a dime store, Ben Franklin in northern Minnesota, worked there and had opportunities to really sort of lean into being responsible for things, for ordering, for, you know, interacting with customers and for interfacing with other employees and, you know, management and those sorts of things. And it gave me a lot of opportunity to truly experience what that looks like, to show up in that space, to be visible, to be present, and to be held accountable for the things that you do or don't do. And so when I really think back to that, I held that position for 4.5 years before I graduated high school, and then worked, you know, a couple of summers through undergrad. And that would be one of the places where I can look back and say, yeah, that was a lot of responsibility in a public facing way. I wasn't yet supervising, I wasn't managing, but I was taking care of the pet department at that store. And so I literally was managing lives based on their well-being. So something to be said for that. That's probably a place where a conversation starter with my therapist would be a good place to turn next. I love it.
That makes a lot of sense, and I love it. I'm thinking back to my own experiences working as a young man, first sort of getting into the workforce. How do you think it is that that initial experience, I heard a couple of particular words in there: responsibility, accountability. How would you say that you feel like that experience shows up in the leader that you are today?
Yeah, I think it's the awareness of the ripple effect. I think that's something that's really important to me, whether I'm working with a client and I'm managing that interaction, or whether I'm managing one of my teams, or whether that's sort of somebody that's, I hate to use hierarchical language, but whether it's someone who is sort of above me in a hierarchy versus below me versus on a lateral position, the ability to recognize that there's a ripple effect to everything that we do. And while I can't control the ripple, I have to be mindful that it exists, and recognizing that from situation to situation, and to some degree trying to be mindful of how big of a splash I make, sometimes huge and it's a cannonball, I'm coming in, and other times I'm like, ooh, let's just ease our way in here, this is a more delicate situation. And so I think the awareness of the interface between all of us within these positions, or within these roles that we fill, I think really factors into what I do as a leader today, in trying to be curious on the front end, to know what sort of ripples might be relevant, but then also to allow. I can't control the ripples. That's not my job. That's not my responsibility. And so how do I hold space for those two competing things?
Well, I love that analogy of the ripples, and I think you articulated really well. And thinking about, yes, the need for leaders especially to be aware of the ripples that are created by decision making, by simply being in the room,
Yes.
even.
Yes.
Especially when we do talk about these, as our society is set up in hierarchical situations, and you could come in and be completely unaware. And the reality is that every single one of us has an impact in every single thing we do
Yes.
at all times. So yes, just resonates so deeply with that and the work of what I would call true leadership, which really brings me to my next question. In this podcast, we're really exploring the essence of leadership, what I call true leadership. And of course, that means different things to different people. So I'm curious, what does true leadership mean, and what makes a true leader to you?
I spent some time thinking about this before coming in. I was like, gosh, what's now this is the rabbit hole that I go down. What's the right answer here? And I was like, wait a minute. Okay, no, again, there is no right answer. It's simply what speaks honestly in this moment. But I did, as I was pondering on that, I made a list of words that resonate with me when I think about the qualities that I strive to embody as a leader. There are things that are very important for me. I think these are not necessarily in any particular order, and that be maybe a whole other exercise in and of itself. I made a list of 10: confidence, humility, curiosity, vision, safety, inspiration, collaboration, profitability, kindness, and vulnerability.
Fantastic list. I'm going to give you a little bit of an exercise here. On the spot,
Yes.
in the moment, which one of those speaks to you most right now? And can we go into one of those a bit more deeply?
Kindness.
What of kindness?
For me, it embodies a lot of there are parallel tracks to many of the other traits, like, whether it's curiosity. I think that's necessary for me in order to be kind. When I think about vulnerability, I think that's captured in there to some degree. I think they're important enough to label on their own, but kindness for me really means I'm really trying to do what's within my power to do, to better the lives, to soften the edges, to better the experience, to enhance the conversations of the individuals that I get the opportunity to work with, and doing that in a way that meets my own needs while also meeting theirs. And that for me, I'm so glad that you asked this particular question, because a colleague and I were chatting a couple weeks back about, on social media, oh, be kind, be kind, be kind. And I thought, God, do any of us ever really pause and think, what does it actually look like for me to be kind? And would I recognize it if I saw it? And I never actually circled back around and did that exercise to do exactly that. So this was a brilliant opportunity for me to do that today, Ty. Thank you.
Well, I love it so much, and part of what I hear you saying there, I'm going to tie it back to what I heard in your first response. To me, it's so much that kindness is not just, well, I was to start here. It seems to me one of the things that frustrates me is when you see a list of directives that says be kind, be, like a to-do list, because those aren't things that you do. Kindness is a state of being, but
yes,
part of what I really hear from that is not just about doing kindness. What I think is kind, it requires an attunement to the environment and to other people. In other words, that ripple effect, for me to be able to ascertain or determine what does kindness look like here.
Yeah.
It's more of a question than a strategy or a tactic in any particular situation. Does that resonate?
It really does. And I think, it really speaks to the idea that, I could operationalize kindness of what it would feel like for somebody to be kind for me. And I could I could run around doing that to everybody. And that's exactly what would happen. I would be doing my kindness to everybody and then full of righteous indignation when nobody recognized the kindness I was doing, and then just a fool's errand in sort of running around in circles. And so it really is the recognition that, and even within an interaction, even between you and I, for example, an hour ago, kindness might have looked different. An hour from now, you might need something completely different from me. You might need nothing from me. Me being kind might be me just being quiet and allowing you to speak. Whatever it happens to be, kindness, it changes.
I love it. I love it so much. And, it really, it comes to the essence of the approach that I offer is, it is a constant willingness to live in the question. What is kindness? What does leadership look like right now? What does kindness look like right now? What does curiosity look like right now? I think it's so profound. I realize that it would be so cool. You could literally have a podcast where I ask what is kindness to every single, right? And it's my idea of this. I have my own little definition of the word contemplation. I'm curious. I think that you'll like this, and we could jam on this a bit. But it's the practice of living into a question which you can never truly have the whole answer to.
I love that.
And I look forward maybe even having you back or off the podcast someday, that we could just go through the rest of those lists, and maybe the rest of that will come out in our conversation today. I want to keep us going a little bit here. Of course, every leader faces moments that test and shape them. I know that each of that list of those 10 words, that didn't just come from you thinking about what to say. There's stories behind each and every one of those. I'm curious, can you share about an experience that you feel like really challenged you, or maybe became a turning point in your own leadership journey?
Yeah, I'd say there were a couple of them sort of in the kind of the middle phase of professional life. And I had a couple of experiences within about a 2 to 2.5 year period of time where I will speak a little bit somewhat cryptically, just because it's not relevant to the story, but only the experience that I took away from it, to know the other details. But in one circumstance, I was an employee. So I was someone who did not have significant authority. I was a professional in this space, but I didn't have significant authority. And the experience that I had in that environment was one where things felt unsafe a lot of the time. Not physically unsafe, but emotionally unsafe, chaotic in a way that was detrimental to the well-being of individuals being able to show up and to be curious and to be focused and to do all of those things. And I remember the weight of that feeling on an ongoing basis. And I remember when I had the opportunity as a very young version of me to sort of speak my truth in that moment, and I didn't do so very professionally, but I remember feeling sort of proud of myself for advocating for my safety. And again, I could do so much. I would do so much differently now if I could go back and bring that back into this space. But the takeaway for that was both in that interaction and then a second interaction, which transpired several years later, where I was being mentored by someone. So not an employer, but I was being mentored by someone whose idea of what I needed as a mentee did not match my growth edge. And so in both of these scenarios, I made decisions to leave those professions, those positions, that role. And I remember walking away from both of them saying, God, now the naive version of me said, I will never do that in my. I now look back and say, I hope that I've never created experiences that resembled what I experienced in those moments for others. Maybe I have, probably I have to some degree. Again, I can't control their anyways, that's a long story. But the bottom line, I walked away. And it taught me as much about what to do as ideally maybe some things to try to avoid, some pitfalls along the way based on how they felt for me. And I didn't want to be responsible for creating or curating an environment in which someone else felt the same.
You know, hate to just sort of continuously loop around to something, but boy, I really hear that. That is that teaching of that ripple effect again, coming through it. And so much of, how else do we learn about what our impact and care about what our impact may be on others, other than by realizing how truly impacted we are by others too.
Yes.
I'm curious, typically like turning points in someone's journey require a letting go of something, or an outgrowing an assumption. In that particular experience, was there something that you feel like you let go of or outgrew in that moment?
Yeah, especially in the second one, I think that the piece that was challenging for me then, and now keeping in mind this was, almost 20 some years ago at this point in time, I was at that stage of my career very much identifying with the professional role that I filled. So I had a label on this position. This is what I do. This is where I will live. This is what I will embody for this next however many number of years until it takes me to finish this. And to truly say, no, I have to say, I don't actually know. I did not have a safe place to land when I walked away from that. And I simply had to say, no, this will not, I do not see this shaping me into the clinician that I believe I have the ability to become. And so I have to say no and simply let that go and trust that with the network, with my then partner, now husband, with the professional relationships that I had, that something would emerge. And it truly was that whole idea of leap and the net will appear. Here I come, you just do it. When it's the right thing to do, you just do it and you figure it out. And it's not because you have to know what the path is, but there will be a path somewhere.
I just love that. I just love that so much. And, can I come back to that first word that you said was confidence? And I'm such a big fan of etymology, and that confidence, con and fide, trust, that at the basis of confidence is trust. And that,
Yes.
And then there's the different levels of confidence, right? There's like confidence in what I know that I'm good at. Like I know that I can walk down the street without falling down. But then there's that deeper level of confidence, what I really hear you speaking to now, which really resonates in terms of that. And when we talk about presence,
Yes.
we talk about the ability to attune, is that trust in the unknown, that trust, that leaping without having any idea where it's heading or how we'll be caught.
Yes.
that is so fundamental and essential. And of course, when we're talking of leadership in this way, it's not just leadership, but being human.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's apparent in talking with you that there's so much growth that comes through this journey of leadership. I'm curious, how, what are the ways that you've invested in yourself or supported yourself in your own growth as a leader and as a human being?
I think most recently, I think there's a couple of things, and in more recent work and leadership life, things have been challenging. I've been going down a couple of paths that turned out not to be the path that I needed to be on in that particular way. So there's also been some practice letting go, but in the midst of it, in trying to do the things, in trying to make it work, I really sacrificed a lot of self in the process. And my therapist had retired in sort of the early side of COVID. I was like, okay, I'm doing okay. I'm fine.
But that is the worst time for your therapist to go into retirement, right?
Thankfully, they were with me during the worst of the early times.
Okay.
And so, well, I was coasting for a bit, but then when it came time to say, wow, I think I actually need help again. I need that reflective voice coming back at me. That individual was no longer available. And the chore of even just figuring out how do I start that process to find a trusted professional, and whether that's therapist or dentist or doctor or veterinary behaviorist or whatever it is, it's a process to find someone that you can have enough experience with to feel safe, that you can trust the feedback they're giving. And so in recent months, just over the last 4 to 6 months, the investment was taking a leap, trusting a friend who said, I don't know if this will be the right fit for you, but here is someone, call them, just do it. Shift gears if you need to, but right now you need support in a way that none of your friends or your family is going to be able to give it to you in quite the same way. So time-wise, sacrifice of all the other things that could be getting done in that time frame, and not to mention the cost of that process. Those are all investments, and I will say that now 4-ish months in, it's really making a huge difference for me. And I'm incredibly grateful that I got that nudge from that individual to say, yeah, it's time. Here you go. Here's the number. Call them. If not, I will grab your phone and I will call them for you.
Hallelujah. Well, thank you to that friend for sure.
Yes.
And so grateful that you found support. I'm a firm believer. It's been challenging for me along the way, but I also have a good system of support behind me, and have come to learn that we were never meant to do it alone. We really weren't.
No.
To anybody out there potentially listening on the edge, especially, leadership, no leadership, doesn't matter. Finding somebody to talk to in that regard, just fantastic. This next question here, I'm hoping that I can corral you a little bit based on our initial conversations, because I want to make sure that anybody listening has the opportunity, and quite selfishly as well, I want to hear, in your vision for the future, would you grace us with a little bit of what's next for you, and such an interesting evolution from veterinary work, and what's next for Dr.
I love this question. It's been something I've really been trying to distill truly over 20 plus years in practice at this point. And I'm grateful to say that I've had this lovely opportunity to work within family systems as a veterinary behaviorist, first setting my sights on the animal, the dog or the cat that I'm working on, but then recognizing the relationship that exists between them and their family system. And whereas a lot of people, I think, look at that and say, oh, well, is it the person? Is it the dog? Kind of who needs to be fixed? My curiosity is really just what's the conversation? What does it look like? Where is it flexible? Where can we make some adjustments? Sometimes it's the dog, sometimes it's the cat, sometimes it's the human, sometimes it's the child, sometimes it's the physical environment, but where can we adjust the conversation? But in order to do that, we have to be curious first. And I find that for so many of the clients that I work with, the pet owners who are in crisis, many of them do not have a fluent skill set in being curious about hard things. And I have found over the years, over the decades now of doing this, that when I'm able to position myself in a way that is essentially shoulder to shoulder, looking at the hard thing with them. In this case, the challenge that they see within their dog. We've been able to share the burden of curiosity. We've been able to understand and start to figure out what is actually flexible, not because I'm telling them what to do, because I'm inviting them to explore things in a safe space to see how that works. And I've been inordinately successful by my measures of success, which is first and foremost creating and enhancing connection within that to then figure out what's doable. All of that to say that that is something that exists for me within the consultation space with my clients. I've found ways to tap into that as a lecturer, as a speaker, and sharing that in front of audiences. The next piece, the next iteration of this for me is kind of a threefold process, really centering itself around storytelling and actually starting to create, working on a book that is based on stories with permission to share, anonymity where that's necessary or appreciated, but storytelling around some of these difficult things, whether it's fear-based behaviors and a default setting of fear in the brains of mammals. If we're trying to adapt to something we've never seen before, how do we show up in those spaces? What does it look like to try to balance cognitive thought and just thinking your way through with feeling your way through? And what does that balance look like? How does that show up within the animals? How can we do that? How can we meet them? How can we meet them where they are? And in doing so, practice what that would look like to do that for ourselves and for the humans around us. And so my goal in this project is to start working on the storytelling element to be able to create the book that illustrates some of those key principles, not because I have the answers, but because I have the ability to tell stories and invite people to see what resonates for them. That will be supported on one side with a much more present brand for Dr. Pachel as the brand through socials and all of the things there, the machine that is that, and then pitching forward toward TikToks and other podcasts and other opportunities to actually work outside of the veterinary industry, because what I'm talking about uses my lens as a veterinary behaviorist, but it's relevant to all of humanity. That's
Wow.
what I'm up to.
I love it so much. I think dogs, pets, mammals,
Yeah.
right? Beings in bodies. Here we are, feeling in the way that I have heard it from my particular teacher that I work with. Feeling is the original language. And a lot of the work that I end up doing with folks is sort of recognizing that we've got to feel our feelings, not just think them.
Yes.
I'm curious, it sounds like some of the work, some of the bridge that's there and what we can get from our non-thinking, non-speaking friends is a direct line into that original language. I'm going to bring you, we could go so deep in that, I could already tell. I'm going to bring you back though to something that you said at the beginning of that, and it's one of the other words on your list. And with a little bit of an eye towards the time, because I feel like we could go on for this, and it's a kind of a big question, but curiosity.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you notice that people have a like you said, share the burden of curiosity. The curiosity is challenging. I'm curious if you can help us understand what you're seeing. What's your sense of what is challenging about being curious, and what are the ways that you have found is helpful to help people deepen into that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different reasons for us as humans to struggle with curiosity. And this is where one of the places where I really do, I not just strive to stay in my lane, but I stay in my lane as a human. I'm not a human therapist. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a social worker. I have enough knowledge to understand how to navigate some of those patterns, but not enough to diagnose and treat them myself. And for me, it's a lovely place to actually exist. And I know that for many of us, speaking for myself specifically, I struggled with a lack of curiosity for a very, very long time because I had a narrative in my head that I needed to be right. And so it wasn't a matter of being curious about all of the options. How could we possibly do that when there was a right answer? And I think there's a certain amount of safety that exists in rightness. There's a safety that exists within black and white thinking. There's a safety that exists within even false dichotomies. It's either this or that. It's us versus them. It's you or there's a safety that exists there. And I think it takes a level of vulnerability to be able to kind of exist across that divide in some way. And so curiosity for me is even sort of just opening our ideas to the questions, the hard questions. What if I'm not right? What if I'm like not even just not right? What if I'm like super wrong? What then? What if I don't know? What if? And by asking some of the what if questions and starting to realize that, God, the more questions I ask, the more implausible that it would ever seem that I actually could know the right answers to all of the things. And man, once you start to get comfortable with that, curiosity gets a whole lot easier. And it's amazing how much of the burden kind of starts to shift away, where I don't have to hold it. I don't have to be the source, even as a professional, even as a certified veterinary behaviorist, where people come for answers. I can be a guide. I can work with them to find the answers that are the most right or the most relevant for them. But that curiosity of looking at it from multiple angles and trying to shift perspective, even it's actually one of the things that I practiced in my early days was whenever I started to get rigid, I would say, quick, 3 alternate explanations for this situation. And some of them were ludicrous. Like, no, that could never happen. I'm like, but my brain came up with 3 alternate explanations. And if all 3 of those are plausible, possible even, how naive would I be to think that I was ever going to always get the right answer? And so all of that, to take this back around to wrap up your question, what I'm trying to do with my clients within that space is create little micro moments that allow them to experiment with curiosity. And I may ask relatively benign questions that require them in some way, if they're willing to answer, to be a little bit wiggly in the answer. And so they're not yes or no questions, they're descriptions. And then we can kind of tease that out and I can add a little layer and then reflect it back. And you can almost see some of the rigidity starting to soften. And I'm like, yeah, now we're getting wiggly. Now we're getting wiggly. Now we are actually going to be making some progress in this ability to shift, to reframe what we're doing. But you got to feel safe first. If you're not safe, the last thing you're going to feel is wiggly.
Boy, I can't tell you, and I won't take up too much time to tell you just how much all of that really resonates in terms of curiosity, being courageous. The only little add-on that I'll say there is, there's a way that I say it, which is certainty is the death of clarity, and curiosity is the antidote to certainty.
Yeah.
And this confusing, right, a moment of clarity and extending it out past a point, as opposed to like having that clarity, staying open, being curious and saying, well, what else?
Yes.
What more might there be? What more clarity? Right? We don't have to be wrong. We don't have to be right. We just don't have to have the whole truth. That's all. Yeah.
What
Easier
else
said,
don't I know?
easier said than done. It is a practice, I will say, if you're in the certainty crowd.
Yeah. For sure.
So, how about for you, Kurt? You've already spoken so much about some ways that you've grown through your own leadership. What are some ways that you're being stretched or tested in your leadership and in your life today?
I think one of the growth edges for me right now is, even as I describe sort of what I'm seeing as sort of a bit of a combined next chapter for me, there is a struggle for me within or between ego and impact. And what I recognize is that if I feel like I truly have something to share that could be valuable to the world, then to some degree that message has to reach the world. And it would be very tempting to turn that into a TikTok follower count and say, I am self-important because I have 7 million followers and look at me go. And so I'm constantly right now sort of wrestling with the space between expanding reach without centering self or ego in the process. That is a growth edge for me right now, and I have to be very mindful of where I am in that continuum, because both need to be there. But the balance and the shifting balance, depending on what individual situations call for, is something that I'm trying to be really mindful of. But it's not yet fluent for me, so I really have to practice. And I'm appreciating some of the folks I have around me who are very supportively pointing out when they see that I might be straying a little bit in one direction or the other, usually ego, but
I need similar people in my life. So, so again, thanks to all that system of support behind you, Chris.
yes.
Fantastic. This last question is a little bit more of an invitation. Wanted to grant you the time and the space here to offer to our listeners whatever it is that's most in your mind and heart to share right now, anything at all. Please take your time. The floor is yours.
I think the thing that's in my heart at this point, in this moment, having turned 50 this summer, it's a big thing for me. You know, I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it, but this sort of perspective of cool. So that was the first half of my life, you know, ideally speaking. Amazing. I am just getting warmed up. And yet, as I'm thinking, what do I do with this next chapter? I'm really leaning into authenticity. And I'm going to share a phrase. I'm going to borrow this from a good friend of mine by the name of Lynn Unger. She's a poet. She's a co-founder of an organization called the Lima Beings that I'm a member and co-founder of, as I said. But as we were talking about the very recent and sad passing of Jane Goodall, and the life's work, the mission, the drive, the passion, that Lynn blurted out the words "solid chocolate rabbit," and the rest of us kind of paused in our moment. I was like, tell me more. And she used those three words to embody the idea of someone, something like the solid chocolate rabbit. You could cut it in any particular way. You could take a bite from the ear or the foot or the middle, but all you're going to get is solid chocolate. It is true to its core, the essence of what it is and how it shows up in the world. And at least to the outside perspective, Jane Goodall is one of those individuals that really kind of seems like solid chocolate rabbit. And so I think about authenticity and what does it look like to be as whole and complete in what I do and how I show up in one moment to the next in a way that speaks to the legacy of someone like Jane Goodall. And I think about folks who are either still living or who have passed. I think about Fred Rogers. I think about everything about, the invitation of won't you be my neighbor? And, those sorts of things. I think about just, again, so many individuals who embody that solid chocolate rabbit, and their solid chocolate rabbit is embodying curiosity and kindness and passion and wanting to better the lives of others around them, and to both sort of follow the paths of those who have come before, but also to reach down and over and around for the folks who also need additional support. It's not about an either or, it's the community that exists together for all of us, with all of us, to be able to do that. And so as I'm heading into this 51st year, I just kind of keep repeating the words to myself, solid chocolate rabbit. Not because it's the perfect thing to do, but can I feel when I feel a little hollow? Can I feel when I feel like there might be a little bit of marshmallow fluff in that left side over there? I'm faking it, and that's okay. But what would it look like to look and feel and to practice coming back into that full congruence of everything from every angle, That's just how it is, with all of its perfectly imperfect flaws. That's part of the Solid Chocolate Rabbit. That's what's in my heart.
Boy, I think that we have found both the title for this podcast episode and potentially the dedication to Jane Goodall, if that makes sense. Yeah. And the work that she's done. Chris, I cannot thank you enough. I've truly, truly enjoyed our conversation, reconnecting with you again after all of these years. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with me here today. I am so sure that anybody who is fortunate enough to hear this episode is equally going to benefit from what you've shared here today. Thank you so much for being on the True Leadership Podcast.
Thank you, Ty. It's been my pleasure. And truly, conversations like these where we get the opportunity to look both forward and back and to reflect on where we're going, where we've been, and truly where we are in this moment are a gift. So thank you for your ability to invite that and to collaborate. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. That's it for this episode of the True Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can subscribe to YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this to catch future episodes. This conversation was brought to you by One Mountain Leadership, where we help leaders grow the capacity, confidence, and presence of true leadership through the True Leadership approach. To learn more about the approach, our offerings, our community, and how we can help you realize your potential in both leadership and in life, visit us at onemountainleadership.com.